What if the biggest problem was never understanding Jesus, but being willing to listen to what he actually meant? Silence. Before any answer, allow that silence. Because it was in silence that many of Jesus' deepest teachings were spoken, and it's also where almost no one stays long enough to truly listen. Millions of people around the world quote Jesus Christ every single day. They repeat his words, defend his name, wear symbols, attend churches, share verses. And yet, many of them live trapped in constant fear, inner guilt that eats away at them, judgment of others, and an anxiety that never rests. Something doesn't add up. If Jesus spoke of inner freedom, why do so many remain spiritually imprisoned? This is the great paradox. A teacher who spoke about peace in the midst of chaos, followed by people who live in constant inner conflict. A message of unconditional love, practiced by minds filled with comparison and defensiveness. A teaching of liberation often turned into yet another burden. So an uncomfortable question arises, one that is rarely asked out loud. If Jesus' teachings are so clear, why do they produce so little real transformation? Why did he repeatedly say, "Whoever has eyes to see, let them see, and whoever has ears to hear, let them hear"? What is it that most people are not seeing? What is being heard only on the surface, but never understood in depth? Perhaps the problem was never a lack of information. The world is overflowing with information about Jesus, books, sermons, videos, courses, ready-made quotes. Maybe the issue is something else. Maybe there is a vast distance between knowing the words and allowing them to pass through the ego, touch awareness, and unsettle internal certainties. Jesus did not speak to please. He spoke to awaken, and awakening is never comfortable. Awakening requires questioning everything that seems solid: identity, control, moral certainty, personal narratives. That's why many people prefer a Jesus who confirms what they already believe, rather than a Jesus who reveals what they avoid looking at. This is not a typical religious video. It's not an invitation to agree, nor to adopt a new belief. It's an invitation to awareness, exactly as Jesus did. An invitation to observe, in silence, how you listen to his words. With defensiveness or openness, with fear or curiosity, with a need for control or a willingness to get a little lost. Because understanding Jesus requires more than declared faith. It requires inner courage. It requires a willingness to be uncomfortable. It requires the honesty to admit that perhaps we have used his teachings as shelter, when he always offered them as a path. And this is where things start to get interesting. Because the first reason almost no one understands Jesus begins with how we think. The human mind loves straight lines. It wants a beginning, a middle, and an end. It wants clear rules, direct instructions, answers that fit into short sentences. From an early age, we're conditioned to believe that understanding means explaining, organizing, categorizing. The mind wants to know what's right and wrong, what to do and what to avoid, who's in and who's out. But Jesus never spoke to that layer of the mind, and that's where the misunderstanding begins. Jesus taught through parables, symbols, open images. He spoke of seeds, fields, narrow gates, light and shadow. He rarely gave direct instructions. He almost never explained everything. His words were invitations, not manuals, mirrors, not formulas. And this deeply unsettles the literal mind because it craves control, guarantees, certainty. The ordinary mind asks, "What exactly do I need to do to be right?" Jesus responds with a story that seems to answer nothing, and at the same time answers everything. When someone tries to understand Jesus using logic alone, something curious happens. The words are read, analyzed, debated, but they don't penetrate. They remain on the surface of thought. It's like trying to explain silence using only words. Something essential always slips away. Because silence isn't understood, it's perceived, and Jesus' teachings work the same way. Take a familiar phrase, turn the other cheek. To the literal mind, this becomes submission or weakness, or an impossible ideal, dismissed as naive. But Jesus wasn't talking about automatic behavior. He was pointing to an inner state where the ego no longer governs reaction, where there's no need to prove worth, defend identity, or defeat another. The logical mind misses this because it's too busy arguing whether it's right or wrong. Deny yourself. The mind interprets this as repression, guilt, self-erasure. But Jesus wasn't speaking against essence. He was speaking against the ego-built identity, the character fueled by comparison, fear, and control. At that level, denying yourself isn't self-destruction. It's freedom from an invisible prison. My kingdom is not of this world. How often has this been taken as escapism, as a distant promise after death? The mind loves to push truth far away. But Jesus was pointing to a level of awareness that doesn't depend on external structures. A kingdom not born of power, status, or recognition, but of presence, of a gaze no longer hypnotized by the world's game. The egoic mind, however, experiences all of this as a threat. Without clear rules, it feels unsafe. Without immediate reward, it loses interest. The ego needs identity. I'm right, I'm saved, I'm different, so it turns teachings into doctrine, systems, something it can control. That way, it feels like it understands, when in reality, it has only organized concepts. We were all conditioned this way. From childhood, we learn to seek answers outside ourselves, to trust what we're told more than what we perceive, to accumulate certainty as a form of protection. And then Jesus appears almost unsettlingly, saying the path is not outside, that truth doesn't come packaged, that what matters cannot be possessed, only lived. This creates discomfort because living requires presence, inner silence, observing thoughts without identifying with them, and the ordinary mind would rather do something than simply be. It would rather debate Jesus than allow his words to question its own internal structure. Maybe that's why so many people know verses but don't know themselves, why they can explain parables but remain blind to their own fear patterns, why they defend spiritual ideas yet live reactive, tense, always waiting for something that never comes. Jesus didn't speak to be understood like an academic philosopher. He spoke to be lived as direct experience. His words were keys, not ready-made answers. But a key only works when someone decides to open the door. And the mind alone doesn't walk through doors. It only describes them. And even when someone begins to sense this, even when they realize Jesus can't be reduced to logic, there's still a deeper, quieter, harder barrier to cross. Jesus never promised comfort to the ego. He promised truth. That single sentence explains why so many drift away from what he actually taught. Because living truth doesn't stroke identities. It dismantles illusions. And Jesus did this constantly, directly, and yet profoundly subtly. He didn't point outward. He didn't tell people where to find enemies, villains, or saviors. He turned attention inward again and again. The kingdom of God is within you. Spoken so simply, yet carrying a silent explosion, because if the kingdom is within, there's nowhere to run. No temple can replace self-observation. No ritual can substitute for awareness. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Many love the word freedom. Few love the path that leads to it, because knowing the truth at this level isn't about collecting spiritual information. It's about facing what has been avoided for years, seeing repetitive patterns, automatic reactions, internal stories that prop up the ego, and that's frightening. Most people prefer a faith that comforts, not a truth that transforms. A faith that soothes anxiety without touching its root. A faith that promises protection but doesn't require honesty. A faith that confirms an existing identity instead of dissolving it. Jesus didn't offer that. He offered a mirror. Looking inward isn't romantic. It's not a light journey, as it's often portrayed. It's confrontation, an encounter with shadows, old wounds, unacknowledged desires, fears disguised as virtue. It's realizing that many of our good actions are driven by fear of rejection, that much of our love is conditional, that a large part of our spirituality is an attempt at control. And this is where resistance arises, not intellectual, but emotional. People don't reject Jesus' teachings because they don't understand them. They reject them because, at some level, they feel what they demand. They sense that something would have to die. Not the body, but the narrative. Not life, but the character. Look honestly at everyday life. People who pray for peace while feeding inner conflict daily. People who speak of love but live defensively, always ready to protect or attack. People who claim to follow Jesus yet cannot let go of control, the need to be right, the identity of victimhood or moral superiority. Jesus saw this clearly. That's why his words often disturb the religious more than those considered lost. The lost knew they were lost. The self-righteous were deeply identified with a spiritual ego. And there's something rarely said plainly, rarely taught the way Jesus taught it. Something that, when seen, creates silence and even fear. What Jesus pointed to wasn't an improved ego. It was the end of its rule. Not a more spiritual version of me, but the recognition that this me is a fragile construction. When this begins to be seen, everything changes. Faith stops being emotional armor. Spirituality stops being a label. Practice becomes internal, quiet, constant. But before that, there's resistance. Fear of losing reference points. Fear of not knowing who one is anymore. Jesus didn't come to reinforce identities. He came to dissolve them. He didn't come to say, "You are special." He came to show that when the ego falls away, something far greater appears, something that doesn't need to prove or defend anything. And as this understanding emerges, another unavoidable perception comes with it. The greatest conflict in life isn't between people, religions, or ideas. It's between awareness and ego, between what observes and what reacts. From the beginning, Jesus was deeply unsettling to institutional religion. Not because he rejected spirituality, but because he exposed what it hid, the use of the sacred as a tool for power, control, and identity. He didn't confront faith, he confronted hypocrisy. He confronted fear disguised as virtue. The religious leaders of his time knew the scriptures. They mastered rituals, laws, traditions, but they lived far from direct experience. Jesus saw this clearly. That's why he said things that sounded almost offensive to those who felt spiritually superior. He spoke of whitewashed tombs, beautiful outside and empty within, of blind guides leading the blind, not to humiliate, but to reveal. Institutional religion offers the ego something it enjoys: belonging, identity, security. It creates clear structures, defined roles, visible rules. That's not inherently wrong. The problem arises when structure replaces awareness, when ritual replaces presence, when repeating words becomes more important than living their meaning. Over time, Jesus' teachings were organized, systematized, institutionalized, turned into doctrines, moral codes, polished sermons. Something was lost in the process, not the words themselves, but the invitation to direct experience. Living was replaced by repetition, transformation by obedience. There's a subtle but fundamental difference between following Jesus and worshipping Jesus. Worship is admiration at a distance, talking about him. defending him as an idea. Following is allowing his words to pass through your life, watching how you react, judge, resist. It's an inner path, not an external position. In modern life, this shows up subtly. Many people have replaced presence with automatic rituals, deep listening with ready-made speeches, self-observation with spiritual opinions. Repetition creates a sense of safety, but safety is not transformation. Jesus never offered safety to the ego. He offered truth to awareness. When spirituality becomes merely a social identity, it loses its power. When it turns into habit, it loses its ability to awaken. Jesus didn't want followers who memorized his words. He wanted people willing to live from a different center, deeper, quieter. Maybe that's why he was so misunderstood, because he didn't fit structures, because he didn't reinforce systems, because he spoke from the inside out, while most were used to living from the outside in. And then a question arises that doesn't need to be answered out loud, only felt. Are we defending Jesus or avoiding living him? The hardest teaching of Jesus isn't loving your neighbor, it's letting go of the ego. Love, in the way Jesus pointed to it, isn't a moral effort. It's not forced behavior. It's a natural consequence when the ego loses center stage. And that's exactly where most people retreat, because the ego doesn't want to be released. It wants to be improved, recognized, validated. It wants to stay in control, even dressed in spiritual language. Jesus spoke of detachment, surrender, trust. Not as pretty ideas, but as lived experiences. The ego, however, survives on comparison, judgment, guilt, and fear. It needs to measure itself against others. It needs to be right. And that is the opposite of what Jesus meant by gentleness, simplicity, and surrender. That's why this teaching is rarely accepted deeply. It promises no gain, only loss. It doesn't add to identity. It removes. It doesn't build a spiritual image. It dismantles all of them. And that's where many turn back. Not because they disagree, but because they feel what it requires. Letting go of the ego doesn't mean disappearing or becoming passive. It means no longer living from the fear of loss, rejection, or inadequacy. It means no longer needing to prove worth. But this freedom passes through a symbolic death. The death of the story we tell about who we are. The death of the character we learn to protect. Jesus never romanticized this. He spoke of the cross, of losing life to find it, of a seed that must die to bear fruit, not as punishment, but as a natural process of transformation. Something has to fall away for something else to emerge. And the ego resists this movement with everything it has. That's why many prefer an inspiring but distant Jesus, a symbol, not a path. Because following this teaching allows no shortcuts. You can't let go of the ego without feeling fear. You can't cross this threshold without discomfort. And then the inevitable, almost whispered question arises. If this is the teaching few accept, who actually understands Jesus? Those who begin to understand Jesus' teachings deeply rarely stand out. They don't draw attention. They don't seek spiritual status or feel the need to prove faith. There's something quiet about them, a presence that doesn't demand notice, a gaze that doesn't compete. They don't define themselves as more spiritual. They don't collect labels. They don't use faith as identity. The further they go, the less they need to assert themselves. There's a simplicity in them that comes not from naivety, but from inner clarity. They've learned to practice silence, not just outer silence, but inner. They observe thoughts without becoming them. They notice reactions before they turn into actions. They allow discomfort without immediately escaping it. This changes everything. Where presence exists, the ego loses strength. They accept discomfort as part of the path. They don't look for spiritual shortcuts to avoid pain. They don't use Jesus as emotional anesthesia. When they fail, they observe. When they fall, they learn. They don't punish themselves, but they don't justify themselves either. There's responsibility without guilt, awareness without harshness. They live more in the present than in expectation. They aren't constantly projected into the future or trapped in the past. They understand imperfectly that what Jesus pointed to can only be lived now. Transformation happens here, not later. They aren't perfect. They still feel fear. They still stumble. They still get irritated. The difference is they don't build identity around it. They don't defend themselves constantly. They don't need to be right. This creates space. And in that space, something deeper appears. Anyone can walk this path, not through merit or moral effort, but through inner willingness. Willingness to look, to listen, to not know. Willingness to let old reference points fall away without rushing to replace them. Jesus never spoke of spiritual elites. He spoke of availability. There's something deeply human in this understanding, something that doesn't separate, but brings closer. Those who begin to understand Jesus don't feel above others. They feel closer, more real, less fragmented. And in that quiet recognition, a different kind of calm arises. Not the calm of having everything figured out, but the calm of no longer running. A calm that doesn't depend on circumstances because it comes from within. Now we return to the initial question, but it sounds different. Not as an external challenge, but as an intimate invitation. Perhaps most people never understand Jesus' teachings because they try to understand him without transforming. Because they seek answers without allowing the questions to pass through them. Because they want security where he offered freedom. Jesus didn't ask for agreement. He asked for presence. He didn't ask for admiration. He asked for awareness. His words were never meant to strengthen what already exists within us, but to reveal what lies beyond fear, beyond identity, beyond the need for control. And that requires something rare, the willingness to not know who you are for a moment. Seen this way, everything aligns. It's not lack of faith that blocks understanding. Often, it's too much of it. When faith becomes a shield rather than an opening. When it turns into an elegant way of avoiding meeting oneself. Understanding Jesus at this level isn't an intellectual act. It's a quiet, ongoing inner movement, sometimes uncomfortable. He spoke to those willing to lose in order to find, to let go in order to receive, to die symbolically in order to be reborn. Not as a future promise, but as a present reality. That's why his words remain alive, not because they're old, but because they point to something that happens now whenever someone truly listens. There's no accusation here, no demand, only an honest invitation to self-examination. In what moments do we use Jesus as emotional shelter? In what moments do we avoid silence because it reveals too much? In what moments do we prefer being right over being at peace? Perhaps understanding Jesus is less about learning something new, and more about unlearning what binds us, less about accumulating certainty, and more about dropping defenses, less about changing the world, and more about observing who we are when no one is watching. And what if what's preventing you from understanding Jesus isn't a lack of faith, but a fear of losing who you think you are? If this reflection stirred something in you, allow yourself to stay with it for a moment. Share in the comments what resonated quietly within you. If this kind of content supports your journey, like and subscribe, not as an automatic gesture, but as a sign that you're willing to keep looking inward.